All right, we're going to jump right into this next panel. Thank you so much, Matt, for your keynote. We're here with Congressman Torres and Congressman Gottheimer. We're going to talk about the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. So let's jump right into this. The BRCA, as we just discussed, it provides clear guidance that digital asset developers are not money service businesses, that they're not money transmitters, and basically people who create open source software, they shouldn't be regulated as banks. That is more or less what this legislation says. So my first question is directed at you, Congressman Torres. Why did you get involved with the BRCA? Could you walk me through basically recognizing that this is an issue, to actually working on legislation, and then ultimately deciding to co-lead this legislation with Whip Emmer, Republican?
Well, first, it's an honor to be here. I feel like one of our responsibilities in Congress is to create a regulatory environment that enables small businesses, crypto entrepreneurs, Bitcoin entrepreneurs to succeed without fear of weaponization, without fear of arbitrary and capricious enforcement. And I see the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act as the triumph of common sense. Like, I might not be the brightest bulb in the chandelier, but one thing I have is common sense. And it codifies a simple principle, which is if you are not transmitting money, then you are not a money transmitter. And I sit on the Financial Services Committee. I do not sit on the Technology Committee. I feel like financial regulators have no business regulating technology. We should be regulating financial transactions. And that has been guidance that's been adopted by FinCEN. And so my legislation with Tom Emmer is simply the codification of guidance that's been in place since 2013 and reaffirmed in 2019. And it's going to prevent the kind of weaponization that we saw in prior administrations. So.
Congressman Gottheimer, this is a bipartisan bill. You recently signed on as a co-sponsor. I know you've worked on Fit 21 in the past, Clarity Act. Can you talk a little bit about the role of bipartisanship in really getting anything done in Congress, but specifically the Bitcoin and digital asset space? What about Bitcoin makes it unique where you actually can work across the aisle?
Thanks, and thanks for having us. And I think you have great common sense. You are a bright bulb, Richie. Come on. But the point of, I just want to add one thing on the common sense piece. When you explain to people quickly that, hey, if you give somebody $100, your friend $100, and they give $100 back, that is a transaction between two people. It is not, there's no bank involved in that. And that's really what this is, right? And when you get to the stage where you have to get the money out and turn it into a dollar, there are AML requirements, right? That does trigger it. So you're creating an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy that makes no sense, that we wouldn't do if Richie handed me $20, we wouldn't have to go to call the bank and make sure that he's not a terrorist, right? And that's really what this is forcing, and that's where it comes to the common sense piece of this that I think people need to understand. Now, why this is tough overall as a space is because it's tricky, right? It's got a lot of acronyms and a lot of things that a lot of members of Congress, right, don't follow minute to minute, and so therefore it becomes confusing when it shouldn't be. And I think the overall objective has to be of the space is to explain things in simple ways and say, it's just like this, right? And then I've found with a lot of members on both sides of the aisle, then the light bulb does go off and say, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a very important objective that we've got to do here around this space, is try to explain to people in a common sense way. And the way we've been able to get members on both sides of the aisle supporting this legislation, not just this, but broadly speaking, with Fit 21, working on, obviously, Clarity or Genius or other bills that are now floating around, and being able to bring both sides together is to explain it to them. And then I think we're able to get more people aboard and to say you're doing both consumer protection, innovation, allowing the economy the American economy to prosper, right? When you explain it in those ways, this becomes a bipartisan issue very quickly. This is not an ideological, right, partisan issue.
So what I'm hearing is common sense is bipartisan. This is news to a lot of people in the audience.
And so is nonsense.
And so is nonsense.
Nonsense tends to win more, though.
Nonsense has more of a constituency in Congress.
Unfortunately.
Exactly.
Unfortunately.
And a growing one. Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about bipartisanship. Congressman Torres, you are on the Congressional Crypto Caucus. You've been heavily involved with this, right? Just why does it exist? What does it serve to do? What is the importance of that caucus?
Look, it's meant to send a message that crypto and Bitcoin is neither Democrat nor Republican. It's profoundly American. It transcends partisanship. There's nothing. There's just like, there's nothing partisan about AI or quantum computing or biotech or any technology. I feel like technology is our greatest strategic asset, and we should see it as something that transcends partisanship. And Bitcoin is here to stay. It's like it has revolutionized the world. It's revolutionized the flow of money. And so the question is, how do we best regulate these new revolutionary technologies? But debating the utility of technologies that have shown their utility strikes me as a useless exercise. But uselessness is what we do often in Congress. So,
Congressman Gottheimer, back to you. You touched on actually explaining this to other members, and I think one of the challenges with this piece of legislation specifically, Matt, in your talk, you dig into there's the protocol, and there are applications built on top of a protocol, and you start talking about some of these things, and people who aren't very technical, people who don't necessarily understand coding, computers, right? Any of these things, honestly, their mind might just wander, right? So could you dig into a little bit more? You say, actually explaining this to people, what does that look like? And what are some of the challenges of explaining a pretty technical piece of legislation, whether it's the BRCA or even broader, market structure, stable coins? How do you take things that are complex and actually distill it down for your fellow members?
It's a great question. And listen, the good news is everybody in this room, you live in this world, right? So just for a second, pretend you didn't, and you're explaining this to your neighbor or your parent, and I'm sure you have conversations sometimes and they glaze over, right? It's not the members of Congress can't figure it out. It's just they have 50 other things to deal with every day, and this might not be their issue. For us, it's one of our issues that we are excited about and focused on nearly every day. So we get into the questions, we dig into it more, and this way it comes back to I'd urge you to be patient. I know it's really frustrating, but keep in mind that it probably took decades for most members of Congress to get past the horse and buggy when the car came out, right? And then all the new rules that came with that. And what does that mean when there's a combustible engine? What does that mean, right? And now things moved much more slowly then. Right now, with technology, everything moves so fast. It's both very exciting, but also intimidating, because if you miss a couple revs, it's like you missed out on a huge movement. But that's what I'd urge you to do every time you can. Spend time here, which we're all very grateful for. Sit down with members of Congress, sit down with their staff, and explain it to them of why this is important to America's competitiveness, to our leadership in the world. That's why Ritchie's like, it's not partisan, right? This was great for our country and our future. And if we continue to miss the boat on this, and by the way, I would argue we've not been ahead. Like we were in the apps economy, we were in the cloud. I think we're behind here where we should be in other countries, and we've got work to do to catch up. And if we don't get this regulatory certainty there, we're going to keep falling behind. And it's up to us, everyone in this room, to explain to people why and why that's very dangerous to our economy, to consumer protection, and to our future.
Can I add? I feel like we as elected officials have to understand our proper role. Like our role is not to determine the utility of technologies for the public. Like let the market make that determination. And the people have spoken. Like millions of people have voted with their feet and are embracing Bitcoin. And that the will of the people should be respected in the halls of Congress.
And it's exciting, right? I mean, we have to explain to people that this is an exciting time and an exciting thing for our country. And I think that often it's just like, wow, we should just push that aside and make it go away, as Richie's pointing out.
And what I love about Bitcoin is it transcends, Nietzsche once wrote a book, Beyond Good and Evil. There's a sense in which Bitcoin is like beyond capitalism and socialism, because it has appeal to both the left and the right. For the left, it's radically independent of corporate America, but for the right, it's radically independent of government. And so it's one of the few technologies that can build coalitions that span the ideological spectrum.
Did you notice how Ritchie started this conversation by saying, I'm not that smart, and then he quoted Nietzsche?
But I could have misquoted him, so,
Here, Matt, you're one of Bitcoin's earliest.
I literally just used ChatGPT right now.
I was going to say, someone check that quote, please. Thanks.
You're one of Bitcoin's earliest known core developers. You've been leading advocacy efforts on the Regulatory Certainty Act. You spoke right before this panel. What's been your approach, right, in explaining this, whether it's to lawmakers or just members of the general public? You have a technical background. How do you relate your background to broader advocacy?
Yeah, it's certainly tough. Obviously, the reality of how important the BRCA is gets very, very, very technical, and so I think it has been tough to convince people how important it is, just because it's not just stuff we have today that we're building today and all these L2s, but it's also more L2s coming down the line, things people have been talking about, have designed, have sketched, but haven't even remotely started building, haven't really started talking about. It's not super, at a conference, at a presentation, whatever. And so it's not in the minds of most Bitcoiners. And so it is really tricky to communicate just how important it is, and not just, it's important because we have this case with the privacy services and we want them to only charge one of the charges and not the other charge. It's like, all right, well, that's not a compelling argument. So instead, somehow you have to communicate like, okay, no, these are actually fundamental, foundational technologies to how Bitcoin is starting to operate and will operate in the future. And to enable people to have the utility of Bitcoin, all these great things that we care about in Bitcoin, but actually bring it to more people, we need this regulatory certainty. And so it is tricky to communicate, but certainly hopefully I did an okay job.
I think what we've hit on here is we've barely even begun to scratch the surface of what Bitcoin and broader digital assets can even be, right, from an application level. And so just as in the early days of the internet, right, you had chat rooms and things of that nature, and then 20 years later, you have, same day Amazon delivery via robot, right, enabled by the internet. 20 years from now, we don't even know, what is possible with Bitcoin.
But even in its embryonic stages, it has shown itself to be the greatest tool for wealth creation in the world. Like, I think Bitcoin was worth $1 in February of 2011. And at its peak, it was 112,000. That's an 11 million% growth. I'm not aware of any equities or any corporation or any real estate that has grown by 11 million%. And so it's just a level of wealth creation that has no precedent in human history. And I think anyone who continues to question the utility of Bitcoin is simply ignoring what's happening in the world.
It's also greatly democratized, right? I mean, it's so easy for anyone to participate and be part of it and to watch it and engage in it, which is why you see so many young people excited about it, right? Of course, all backgrounds. Right, and I think that's also part of what's exciting about it.
It's one of the most democratized financial shifts we've seen. I mean, you look at all these, the huge returns are when you invest in a really early stage startup where you are hunting, you're going to all kinds of meetups in San Francisco to find that early stage startup and you get a great return. Bitcoin, you just had to be online and paying attention and think this is cool. And all of a sudden, it's way more democratized, huge returns than any other asset by far.
And I feel like it's going to take on even greater value in what feels like an age of de-dollarization.
To this point, so we've talked about what Bitcoin can be, right, and in the context of the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, and then we're talking about what Bitcoin is. And Bitcoin right now, in many ways, is analogous to digital gold. It is today the 5th largest asset in the entire world, which is nuts, right? This stuff didn't exist 20 years ago, and now it is gold. There are 3 companies, and there's Bitcoin, right? And that's the ordering of the largest assets in the world. So I want to, ask briefly, starting with you, Congressman Gottheimer, and then to you, Congressman Torres. What are your thoughts about the United States holding some Bitcoin on its balance sheet, right? This is a Bitcoin conference. A lot of people here are interested in strategic Bitcoin reserve. There's, the Bitcoin Act on the House, in the House and the Senate. But just as, conceptually, 5th largest asset in the world. What do you think about the government owning Bitcoin, especially if it's done in a way that doesn't cost taxpayers money?
Well, I think right now we have about $20 billion that's seized, right, and that we're holding as a country because of that. I think the reserve part is a really, and I think this is a very important debate that we should have on the Financial Services Committee, and I think it's something we should study, and I'm really curious about. And how it would be done, how would we set it up, what would the cost taxpayers be, what would the impact on the dollar be, but I think one that and I'm encouraging a bunch of us to actually have this discussion because I think we should, and that's where the world's going, to Richie's point, right, and so that's what I think.
The U.S. has 5% of the world's gold. One of the theses is essentially, hey, if we have 5% of the world's gold, we should have 5% of the world's digital gold. So what are your thoughts?
I actually feel like the value of Bitcoin is more secure than the value of gold because you can always find more gold, but the supply of Bitcoin in the world is going to remain fixed in perpetuity. Look, I cannot tell you whether a century from now the United States is going to remain the world superpower, whether the dollar is going to remain the world's reserve currency, whether we're going to remain a democracy. what I can tell you is that Bitcoin is going to be a force to be reckoned with 100 years from now. I can state that with certainty. Like, it's clear this is a technology that has staying power, that's as close to eternity as a temporary technology can be.
There will only ever be 21 million. It is written in code. We're at time. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.